I still remember the sound of that first dump truck because it didn't sound like construction to me. It sounded like someone slamming a vault door on years of my life. And by the time the last truck pulled away, the men responsible believed they had buried 28 tons of waste where nobody would ever question it. What they didn't know was that they had chosen the worst possible neighbor to lie to. My name is Ethan Caldwell. I'm 53 years old. And if you ask the folks around Traverse Ridge what I do for a living, they'll tell you I'm the guy who spends more time staring at dirt than people, which honestly isn't far from the truth because I've spent nearly 3 decades working as an environmental soil analyst. The kind of person who notices when the ground changes color after a rainstorm or when the smell of wet clay suddenly carries a sharp chemical edge that doesn't belong. There. My wife used to joke that I could identify a field blindfolded just by holding a handful of soil in my palm. And every time she laughed, I'd tell her that dirt tells stories if you know how to listen. After years of consulting work, I finally bought a little orchard outside the town of Maple Creek, a quiet place with rolling hills where mornings smelled like dew and fresh grass instead of traffic and diesel fumes. It wasn't some giant commercial farm, just over 6 acres with rows of tart cherry trees that I planted one by one until they felt more like family than crops. And every spring when the blossoms opened, people stopped their cars just to take pictures. The orchard paid the bills well enough, but money was never the reason I loved it. I loved knowing that every tree stood on soil I had spent years restoring, balancing nutrients, adjusting drainage, and nurturing back to health. Some people raised children, I raised land. The trouble started when the empty property next to mine was sold to a development company called North Valley Infrastructure. Their signs appeared overnight, promising modern homes and community growth, and most of my neighbors celebrated because they believed new houses meant higher property values. I didn't celebrate or complain. I simply walked over one afternoon carrying a coffee mug and introduced myself to the foreman. He was a broad man with mirrored sunglasses and a permanent grin that looked less friendly the longer you stared at it. "Afternoon," I said. "I'm Ethan from next door. Just wondering what you're putting in so close to the fence." He laughed before answering, pointing toward the excavator digging an enormous pit. "Retention basin," he said. "Everything's approved. You'll probably like it better than the weeds that used to be here." I nodded because there wasn't much else to say. Construction happens. People build things. But as I walked back through my orchard, something bothered me. They weren't digging where water naturally flowed. They were digging in the highest section of the property, which made no engineering sense for a drainage basin. I told myself maybe I was overthinking it because that's what specialists do. We see problems everywhere. A week later, I woke before sunrise to the sound of engines and watched 3 dump trucks back into the pit. Through binoculars, I expected gravel or clean filled dirt, but instead I saw shattered concrete slabs, twisted steel rods, cracked asphalt chunks, broken insulation panels, and what looked suspiciously like old railroad ties darkened with chemicals. One truck emptied splintered lumber, stained almost black. Another dumped bags that burst open in a gray powder before a bulldozer pushed everything together. My stomach tightened. That wasn't construction fill, that was demolition waste. Around lunchtime, I walked over again and caught the same foreman wiping sweat from his forehead. "You sure that's going into a retention basin?" I asked. He smiled without looking at the pit. "Friend, unless you plan on buying this property, I'd worry about your cherries and let us worry about ours." The workers nearby chuckled, and one younger guy shook his head as if he almost felt sorry for me. I stood there for another second before saying quietly, "I already am worried about my cherries." The foreman shrugged. "Then pray for rain." I walked away, but those words followed me all afternoon. That evening, my neighbor Linda stopped by carrying homemade peach pie, like she always did, and asked if I'd seen all the trucks. "Probably harmless," she said. "These companies know what they're doing." I smiled and thanked her for the pie, but after she left, I grabbed my sampling kit from the shed. Experience has taught me one lesson above all others. Innocent projects welcome questions, dishonest ones laugh at them. The next morning, I began taking baseline soil samples along my fence line, marking every location with flags and GPS coordinates while the construction crew watched from across the property. One of them yelled, "You writing us a love letter?" Another shouted, "Careful, professor, don't hurt the dirt." I ignored them because pride has never produced good science. By sunset, I had dozens of carefully labeled containers sitting in my workshop beside notebooks filled with measurements. And although I hadn't tested anything yet, I already felt that uneasy silence doctors must feel before opening lab results they suspect will change someone's life. I looked out the window toward my orchard where the setting sun painted the cherry trees gold, and for the first time since planting them years earlier, I caught myself wondering what they would look like if they started dying. And somehow that thought scared me more than losing the money, because you can earn money again, but watching something you've spent years nurturing collapse because someone else chose greed over responsibility leave a different kind of wound. As I sealed the last sample container, I told myself I was probably being overly cautious, that in a week I'd laugh at my own paranoia and apologize for assuming the worst. But deep down, another voice kept whispering that the dirt was already trying to tell me a story, and if I listened carefully enough, someone very powerful might soon wish I hadn't. The next 4 days became a routine that probably looked ridiculous to anyone driving past the orchard because while everyone else in town was talking about baseball scores and the weather, I was crawling through damp soil with sample tubes, notebooks, and a portable testing kit that had cost more than my first pickup truck. And the funny thing about science is that it doesn't care about feelings. It doesn't care who owns the land or who has more lawyers or bigger equipment. Numbers simply tell the truth if you collect them honestly. Every evening, I carried the samples into my workshop where shelves lined with old reference books and maps made the place look more like a college laboratory than a farm building. And I'd sit there until midnight running analyses while an old radio played classic country songs in the background. At first, I hoped my instincts were wrong. I wanted to discover that the strange material was harmless fill, maybe ugly to look at, but chemically stable. Instead, every new result pulled the ground out from under me. Acidity levels were changing far faster than healthy soil should ever change. Trace metals were appearing where they had never existed in my historical records, and organic contamination indicators were climbing along the fence line closest to the excavation. I reran the test twice because no professional wants to believe bad data, but the numbers came back almost identical. I leaned back in my chair sometime after 1 in the morning and stared at the ceiling. No, this can't be right. I muttered to myself, yet the charts lying across the table seemed to answer, yeses. The following afternoon, my friend Carl, a retired surveyor who occasionally helped me repair fences, stopped by and found me studying maps. "You look like someone stole your dog," he joked. I slid the paperwork across the table. He looked for a minute before asking, "Is this bad?" I answered, "If these readings keep moving this direction, I'm not worried about next year's harvest. I'm worried about whether this land will still be healthy 5 years from now." Carl whistled softly and looked toward the neighboring construction site, where another convoy of trucks rolled through the entrance. "You going to call the county?" he asked. "I'm going to ask questions first," I replied. People deserve the chance to tell the truth before they get caught lying. The next morning, I visited the county planning office, a quiet brick building where the receptionist knew almost everyone by name. She smiled and asked what she could help with. "I'd like copies of the permits for the excavation on Ridgeview Road," I said casually. She typed for a few seconds, frowned, typed again, then disappeared into a back office. 10 minutes later, she returned with an uncomfortable smile. "The file isn't available right now. You may need to submit a records request." I thanked her politely because getting angry at front desk employees never solves anything. Outside, however, I sat in my truck for nearly 15 minutes thinking about that answer. Construction companies love permits. They frame them, copy them, wave them around whenever someone complains. If paperwork suddenly becomes difficult to find, something usually isn't right. So I filed a formal public records request and went home to wait. Waiting turned out to be the hardest part because while government offices move at government speed, contamination doesn't. Every morning, I walked the orchard checking leaves and moisture, and one afternoon I noticed several young trees nearest the property line showing faint discoloration around the edges. Most people would have called it stress from changing temperatures, but to me it looked like the first whisper of chemical injury. I touched one branch and remembered planting that tree with my wife 7 years earlier. She had insisted it would someday provide cherries for our future grandchildren. She passed away before ever seeing that happen, so standing there beside that little tree felt strangely personal, almost like someone had insulted her memory. That evening, the county finally responded. The envelope wasn't thick, which immediately worried me, because complete permit packages usually contain dozens of pages. Instead, inside sat a brief letter explaining that after reviewing available records, the office had found no active excavation permit matching the location I requested. I read it 3 times. Then I laughed, not because anything was funny, but because the situation had crossed into unbelievable territory. The next morning, I drove back to the construction site where the foreman was directing equipment. "Mind if I ask one more question?" I called. He looked irritated. "Depends." I held up the county letter. "According to public records, there isn't a permit for that pit." He stared for half a second before smirking. "Then maybe your county doesn't know what it's doing. Or maybe your company doesn't," I answered. The smile disappeared from his face. He stepped closer until we stood only a few feet apart. "Listen," he said quietly, "you're making yourself a problem where there isn't one." I replied just as quietly, "No, I'm trying to figure out why there is one." A silence settled between us until another worker interrupted by asking for instructions, and I walked away without another word. That afternoon, I organized every photograph, every soil sample, every GPS coordinate, and every laboratory result into a formal report nearly an inch thick. Experience had taught me that emotion persuades almost nobody. Documentation persuades everyone. I mailed certified copies to the state environmental agency and included my professional credentials. Not because I wanted special treatment, but because anonymous complaints are easy to dismiss, while evidence from a career specialist becomes harder to ignore. 3 days later, my phone rang from an unfamiliar number. "Mr. Caldwell," a pleasant voice asked. "This is Deputy Commissioner Richard Holloway from the county. I understand you've raised concerns about the Ridgeview project." His tone was calm enough to lower anyone's guard. "That's correct," I replied. "Well," he continued, "I'd hate to see a misunderstanding create unnecessary conflict. Sometimes technical matters look worse than they are. Let me handle this internally and save everyone some trouble." I thanked him, but something about the conversation bothered me. He wasn't asking questions about contamination. He wasn't requesting data. He wasn't interested in my evidence. He simply wanted the issue to disappear. After hanging up, I replayed the conversation in my head until one sentence stood out: "Save everyone some trouble." Everyone, except the orchard owner whose land might be poisoned. That night, Carl came over with burgers from the diner and found me staring at my laptop. "You're not eating?" he asked. "Later. What are you doing now?" I looked up and said, "I'm wondering why a county official is trying so hard to calm me down before he's even looked at the facts." Carl shrugged. "Politics." I shook my head slowly. "Maybe. Or maybe someone already knows what I'll find if I keep digging." The next morning, I submitted another public records request, this time asking for communications between the County Development Office and North Valley Infrastructure regarding the project. The filing fee wasn't huge, but enough to make ordinary people think twice before requesting documents. I paid it anyway, because compared with losing an orchard, paperwork was cheap. While waiting, something unexpected happened. Construction activity slowed. Fewer trucks arrived. Workers who used to laugh at me stopped making jokes and instead watched from a distance whenever I walked the fence line. One afternoon, the younger employee who had mocked my sampling equipment approached quietly while the others were away. He looked nervous. "You didn't hear this from me," he whispered, keeping his eyes on the ground. "But none of us were told what was in those loads. We just dumped what we were assigned." Before I could ask another question, he hurried back toward the machinery. I never even learned his last name, but his expression stayed with me because it wasn't the face of a guilty man, it was the face of someone afraid. 5 days later, another envelope arrived from the county. I carried it into my kitchen, poured a cup of coffee, and opened it expecting routine correspondence. Instead, printed emails slid across the table. The very first message referenced campaign fundraising. The second mentioned scheduling a private meeting with executives from North Valley. The third contained a sentence so unbelievable that I read it aloud just to make sure my eyes weren't inventing words. We'll keep the neighbor complaint contained until the site is fully covered. I sat perfectly still. Outside the kitchen window, the cherry trees swayed in the wind like nothing had changed, but inside that little farmhouse, everything had. Up until that moment, I believed I was fighting careless contractors. Now I realized I might be looking at something far larger, something involving money, influence, and people who assumed nobody would ever connect the dots. And the strange part was that instead of feeling fear, I felt completely calm, because once corruption leaves a paper trail, it stops being a rumor and starts becoming evidence. For almost 24 hours, I told nobody what I had found because there are moments in life when speaking too early can ruin everything. So I scanned every email, backed up every file onto 2 hard drives, mailed copies to my attorney, and even left one sealed envelope with my sister telling her not to open it unless something happened to me, which sounds dramatic until you've spent enough years watching powerful people protect each other. The following morning, I sent the complete package to the state environmental investigators, the Attorney General's office, 2 regional newspapers, and a nonprofit watchdog organization. Then I walked outside with a cup of coffee and started pruning a cherry tree, as if it were any other Tuesday. Around noon, my phone exploded with calls I didn't recognize. Reporters wanted interviews, agency officials wanted clarification, and one television producer asked if I could stand beside the orchard for an afternoon segment because they wanted viewers to see what might be at risk. By sunset, satellite trucks lined the road where kids normally rode bicycles. Neighbors gathered behind fences pretending they were watering flowers while listening to every conversation. And the same construction entrance that had welcomed dump trucks for weeks suddenly became the busiest place in the county for police vehicles and state inspectors. I watched from across the fence as investigators walked the site with cameras and clipboards while the foreman, who once laughed at me, now stood with folded arms answering questions he clearly didn't enjoy. At one point, our eyes met across the excavation, and instead of the confident grin he wore the first day, he simply looked tired. He walked over until we stood on opposite sides of the fence and said quietly, "You could have handled this differently." I looked at the pit behind him and answered, "I tried. Twice." He shook his head. "You just cost a lot of people their jobs." I replied, "No. Someone decided illegal shortcuts were cheaper than doing the right thing. That's who cost them their jobs." He opened his mouth as if he wanted the last word, but none came, and he turned away. The investigation moved faster than I expected because evidence has a way of accelerating bureaucracy when cameras are watching. Excavation crews returned, but this time under government supervision, peeling away layers of soil until broken concrete, treated lumber, rusted metal, insulation, and stained debris emerged exactly where the company insisted nothing improper existed. Every scoop of the excavator seemed to uncover another lie. The television stations replayed the footage for days, and suddenly strangers were stopping me at the grocery store saying, "You're the orchard guy, right?" I never liked that kind of attention, but I understood why people cared. They weren't really watching my story anymore. They were watching their own fears about what happens when money and influence convince people that rules are optional. Within weeks, search warrants became public, financial records surfaced, and investigators discovered a pattern of communications suggesting that inspections had been delayed while the site was being covered. The deputy commissioner who had called me with his calm voice resigned before the formal announcement even reached the evening news. His attorney released a carefully worded statement denying intentional wrongdoing, but documents speak louder than press releases. Company executives hired consultants and crisis managers. Yet every new explanation seemed to create 2 new questions. Meanwhile, my orchard needed saving. State-approved remediation crews installed monitoring wells, removed contaminated material near the property line, and replaced damaged soil with clean engineered fill while specialists tested groundwater. Watching strangers repair land that I'd spent years protecting felt bittersweet, but little by little the numbers began moving in the right direction. The leaves that had worried me months earlier stopped getting worse, and by late summer new growth appeared on branches I feared were finished. One afternoon, my neighbor Linda walked over carrying another homemade pie and laughed through embarrassed eyes. Looks like you were right after all. I smiled and cut us both a slice. I'd rather have been wrong. I admitted. Being right was expensive. She nodded before saying something I'll probably remember for the rest of my life. Maybe, but if you hadn't made noise, everyone else around here would have paid the bill later. She was right. That's the strange thing about corruption. It usually begins by hurting one person, but survives by counting on everyone else staying quiet. Months later, the legal cases finally reached their conclusion. Financial penalties piled up, executives disappeared from public view, contracts vanished, and the development project that promised quick profits became a cautionary tale repeated at county meetings and coffee shops alike. My attorney handed me the settlement paperwork and smiled. "You know," he said, "most people would have sold the orchard and moved away." I looked out the window toward rows of trees glowing under the evening sun and answered, "Then they never understood why I stayed in the first place." The compensation helped restore the property, but the greatest reward wasn't a check or a headline. It was walking through the orchard the following spring and hearing bees return to blossoms that might never have existed if I had chosen convenience over persistence. Sometimes people ask whether all the stress was worth it, and I tell them the truth. I didn't fight because I wanted revenge. I fought because I wanted accountability, and those are two very different things. Revenge ends when someone else loses. Accountability begins when everyone learns. So now I'll leave a question to you. If you discovered that powerful people were risking your home, your land, or your family's future while expecting you to stay silent, would you keep your head down and hope someone else fixed it, or would you speak up even if it meant standing alone? Let me know what you honestly think in the comments, because stories like this rarely divide people into heroes and villains as neatly as movies do, and sometimes the hardest decision isn't proving what's right. It's deciding whether you're willing to pay the price to defend it.